The wind howled through the village of Obodo, carrying whispers of fear and despair. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the distant cries of a mourning mother. Somewhere in the dark, another family had lost a son to the wrath of King Ezego, the ruler who believed himself untouchable. Ezego was not just a king, was a force of terror. His name alone sent chills down the spines of his people. He took what he wanted, punished without mercy, and believed he was beyond the reach of men and gods alike. "No man can challenge me," he often boasted. "No spirit can strike me down. I am Ezego, the immortal king." And for years, the people believed him. The streets of Obodo were filled with empty eyes and broken spirits. Families lived in constant fear of offending the king, knowing that the slightest mistake could bring ruin upon them. Fathers worked from sunrise to sunset, only to have their earnings seized by Ezego's greedy tax collectors. Mothers wept at night, praying that their sons would not be taken to serve in the king's army or die in his cruel punishments. Yet, beyond his golden throne and ruthless warriors, a storm was brewing. A group of young men tired of watching their people suffer gathered beneath the ancient Udala tree, where their ancestors had once met in times of great peril. There, in the cold embrace of the night, they whispered the unthinkable. "We must end his reign." The 5 young men Obi, Chidi, Ifeanyi, Ugo, and Samto had seen their families destroyed by Ezego's cruelty. Obi's father had been executed in the marketplace for failing to meet the king's heavy taxes. His mother had fallen into deep sorrow and no longer spoke. Chidi's mother had been dragged from their home and taken to the palace, never to be seen again. His father, heartbroken, had taken his own life. Ifeanyi's sister had been falsely accused of stealing from the royal storehouse and was stoned to death in front of the entire village. Ugo's land had been seized, leaving his family to starve. His younger siblings had wasted away from hunger, their ribs pressing against their thin skin. Samto's younger brother had been taken as a slave to work in the king's mines, where many never returned. They had nothing left to lose. The moon was full, its pale light filtering through the leaves of the Udala tree as the young men sat in a tight circle. Their voices were low, their words heavy with the weight of their decision. "We cannot wait any longer," Obi whispered. "If we do nothing, more of us will die." "We need power," Chidi said. "Something greater than swords and spears, something that can destroy him." But calling upon such power came with a price. "The spirits do not give without taking." Ifeanyi hesitated. "Are we prepared for what they may demand?" Ugo, his face gaunt from weeks without food, nodded. "Whatever the cost, it is better than living under Ezego's rule." And so, they made a choice that would change their lives forever. But the walls of the village had ears, and the whispers of rebellion traveled fast. One of Ezego's spies, a man desperate to earn the king's favor, had been listening from the shadows. By the next morning, Ezego knew of the young men's plan. The king did not waste time. That evening, as the villagers gathered in the marketplace, Ezego's warriors stormed the homes of the 5 conspirators, dragging them into the open. Their mothers screamed, their fathers begged. But Ezego had no mercy. He stood before his people, his golden robe shining in the dying sunlight, his expression unreadable. "You dare plot against me?" his voice boomed. "You think you can end the reign of Ezego?" The young men, their faces bruised from beatings, did not bow their heads. "Your time will come, Ezego," Obi spat, blood trickling from his mouth. "Even the strongest trees fall to the axe one day." A flicker of something fear, perhaps, passed through Ezego's eyes, but it was gone in an instant. "Then let your blood water the roots of the tree you cherish so much," he said coldly. The villagers gasped as Ezego's warriors unsheathed their machetes. "No, please!" Chidi's mother broke through the crowd, throwing herself at the king's feet. "They are just boys! Please, spare them!" Ezego looked down at her, his face like stone. "Did they spare me when they plotted my death?" He stepped aside. The warriors moved forward. One by one, the young men were struck down. Their screams tore through the night. The sound of steel meeting flesh echoed across the village. Blood soaked into the earth beneath the Udala tree, just as Ezego had promised. Obi's mother collapsed to the ground, wailing. Chidi's younger sister ran forward, only to be pulled back by her uncle. Ifanyi's grandmother clutched her chest and fell, her breath escaping her lips one final time. Ezigo watched it all, unmoved. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice like ice. "No one can touch me." But as he turned to leave, a cold wind swept through the village, rustling the leaves of the Udala tree. It was a wind unlike any other, a whisper of something unseen, something watching. The people shivered. Far away, in the depths of the sacred forest, the spirits had heard the cries of the innocent, and they were not pleased. The village of Obodo was never the same after that night. The blood of the 5 young men still darkened the roots of the Udala tree, a silent testament to Ezigo's ruthlessness. The people spoke in hushed voices, avoiding the king's gaze, fearful that even a whisper of defiance might lead to their doom. Mothers held their children closer, and fathers lowered their eyes whenever Ezigo passed. But something had changed. A strange heaviness hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The nights grew colder and the winds howled through the village like the wails of mourning spirits. The villagers felt it in their Boniza presence, unseen but watching. And then the dreams began. The first to dream was Chidi's mother. She had cried herself to sleep, her son's name on her lips. But in the dead of night, she awoke to the sound of footsteps in her hut. "Mama." Her heart stopped. The voice was faint, almost carried by the wind, but she knew it anywhere. Chidi. Tears blurred her vision as she turned. There, standing in the dim glow of the dying fire, was her son, his face pale, his clothes still stained with blood. "Mama, we are not at rest." She opened her mouth to scream, but her voice failed her. "You must listen." Chidi's voice grew fainter. "We have awakened something. Something old. Something powerful. It will come for him. The one who did this to us." And then he was gone. The next morning, Chidi's mother ran to the marketplace, her eyes wild. "The spirits are awake!" she cried. "They are coming for Ezigo!" But the villagers, terrified of the king's wrath, silenced her with fearful glances. Yet she was not the only one. Obi's father, Ifeanyi's sister, Ugo's grandmother, many had the same dream. The murdered young men came to them in the night, whispering the same message. Vengeance is coming. The king's palace was a fortress, its high walls protecting him from any mortal threat. But what Ezigo did not know was that no walls could keep out the vengeance of the dead. The first sign of his downfall came at midnight. Ezigo was resting in his chamber, the soft glow of the oil lamp flickering against the walls. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind swept through the room, snuffing out the light. Then he heard it. A whisper. "Ezigo." His blood turned to ice. The voice was distant yet close, like a breath against his ear. He sat up, gripping the edges of his bed, his chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. "Who dares?" he barked. No answer. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, a shadow shifted. The air thickened. Ezigo felt something move, a cold, unseen force wrapping around his throat. He gasped, clawing at his neck, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder. "Your time has come." The next morning, the palace servants found their king drenched in sweat, his eyes red with fear. Ezigo did not speak of what he had seen. He was no fool. He knew that fear would make him weak in the eyes of his people. But deep inside, he could feel it. Something was coming for him. And it would not stop. Desperation breeds foolishness. Ezigo, once a man who feared no spirit or man, now sought answers in the forbidden. On the third night of the haunting, he summoned Dibia Okeke, the most feared sorcerer in the land. The old man arrived cloaked in a robe of dark feathers, his face painted with symbols of power. He entered the king's chamber and stood before him, his piercing eyes unblinking. "You have angered the spirits," the Dibia said without being asked. Ezigo's jaw tightened. "Tell me how to stop them." The old man ran his fingers over the wooden charms tied around his neck. "There is only one way." The king leaned forward. "A sacrifice." Ezigo's lips curled. "I have given many sacrifices. I have slaughtered my enemies. What more do they want?" Dibia Okeke shook his head. "Not just any sacrifice. Blood for blood. Life for life. You must offer the thing most precious to you." Ezigo frowned. "And if I refuse?" The Dibbia's eyes darkened. Then, your death will not be swift. The spirits will not just take your life, they will make you suffer first. They will break your body, twist your soul, and drag you to a place where even death is mercy. A shiver ran through Ezego's spine. For the first time in his life, he knew true fear. That night, Ezego made his choice. He summoned his first wife, Nenena, and their only son, Osandu, a boy of 10 years. The boy had always admired his father, despite the cruelty he inflicted upon others. He did not see the monster that the village feared, he only saw a king, his hero. "Father, why have you called me?" Osandu asked, his small hands gripping the edge of Ezego's robe. The king could not meet his son's eyes. His heart was heavy, but his fear was greater. He led the boy and his mother deep into the forest, where Dibia Okeke waited beside a fire that burned blue. Nena, sensing the wrongness of the night, clutched her son tightly. "Ezego, what is this?" But Ezego did not answer. The Dibia stepped forward, holding out a sharp ritual dagger. "The spirits wait, Ezego. A life for a life." Nenena's breath caught in her throat. "Number," she whispered. But Ezego's hands were already moving. Before the boy could cry out, the blade plunged deep into his small chest. A scream tore through the night Nenena's, raw and filled with agony. She collapsed beside her son, cradling his lifeless body, her wails piercing through the trees. But Ezego did not look back. He turned to the Dibia, his voice hollow. "It is done." Dibia Okeke gazed into the fire, listening to the whispers of the spirits. Then, he looked at Ezego, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "The spirits have answered." As Ezego returned to his palace, he felt lighter, as though the weight of death had been lifted from his shoulders. He slept that night, believing he had won. But at the first light of dawn, the screams began. Ezego rushed to the balcony, his heart hammering in his chest. Below, the people of Obodo were running, pointing to the skies. He followed their gaze, and his soul turned to ice. Descending from the heavens was a figure wreathed in shadows, its face shifting between the forms of the 5 young men he had slain. Its eyes burned with the fury of the dead. "You cannot escape us, Ezego." The ground trembled. The king fell to his knees, and the spirits descended upon him. The sun had barely risen over Obodo when the earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of the spirits' fury. For those who dared look up, the sky had turned black, as though the heavens themselves were mourning. A dark cloud hovered directly over the village, blotting out the sun and casting an eerie pallor across the land. The air crackled with tension. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The villagers, paralyzed by fear, dared not move. Even the wind had stilled, as though it too was holding its breath in anticipation. But not Ezego. For the first time in years, the once mighty king was afraid. He had spent his reign sowing fear in the hearts of others, but now he felt it sharp, cold, and suffocating, clutching at his very soul. The figure that descended from the heavens was not of this world. It was a towering, shadowy form, its features shifting between the faces of the 5 young men he had murdered. Their eyes burned with an unearthly fire, and their mouths moved in a language unknown to any living being. But it was the words they spoke that struck terror into Ezego's heart. "You took from us," the spirit intoned, its voice both many and one, a chorus of the dead. "Now we take from you." Ezego's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. His once proud and unyielding frame trembled in the face of the spirit's wrath. His hands, once quick to strike down any who opposed him, now clutched the earth beneath him, seeking some form of solace, some way to escape the inevitable. But there was no escape. "No!" Ezego cried out, his voice breaking. "I am the king! I am untouchable!" The shadowy form reached out with long, gnarled hands, and Ezego's body jerked as if pulled by an invisible force. His screams echoed through the village, but no one dared intervene. It was as though the entire world had turned its back on him. The spirit's eyes locked with Ezego's. "Did you think that power would protect you?" The voice boomed. "Did you think that the blood you spilled would not call for blood in return?" Ezego's breath came in ragged gasps, but he could not tear his eyes away from the vengeful spirit. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had underestimated the consequences of his cruelty. In his hunger for power, he had believed that the world bent to his will, that no force could rival his strength. But now, as the cold grip of death tightened around his chest, he knew the truth. He had sealed his own fate. The spirit began to chant, its voice growing louder, rising in pitch as if invoking a dark, ancient power. The ground beneath Ezigo began to crack, and the air grew heavy with a strange energy, suffocating and oppressive. Suddenly, the earth beneath him split open, and he was dragged into the ground, his body writhing in agony as the dirt swallowed him whole. His eyes were wide with terror as he reached out, his hands clawing at the earth, but there was no escape. The last thing Ezigo saw before the darkness consumed him was the face of Ifeanyi, his eyes filled with sorrow and fury.